Hello, biologists! So far, we've looked at the history of evolution and the evidence for evolution. Today, we're going to be learning about Darwin's theory called natural selection. So grab your packets and a pencil, and let's dive right in. So Darwin worked out the main elements of evolution by natural selection soon after reading Malthus and thinking about artificial selection. His scientific friends urged him to publish his really good arguments, and Darwin did write up a complete draft of his ideas, but he actually put his work aside and didn't publish it for another 20 years. Why? Because Darwin knew that many scientists were currently ridiculing Lamarck's ideas, and Darwin's theory was even more radical, so he wanted to make sure to gather as much evidence as he could to support his ideas before he made them public. So in 1858, he moved forward with his own work, and the next year he published On the Origin of the Species, which described his ideas in detail. He ended up describing a natural process that could operate like artificial selection. Darwin named this new process natural selection, and he described it as the process by which organisms in nature with variations most suited to their local environment survive and leave more offspring. Natural selection occurs in any situation in which more individuals are born than can survive. Natural heritable variation affects the ability to survive and reproduce, which is what we're going to call variations and adaptations. And fitness varies among individuals. Well-adapted individuals survive and reproduce. Generation to generation, populations continue to change as they become better adapted or as their environment changes. Remember that evolution occurs at the population level, not in individuals. There are actually four main forces to Darwin's principle of natural selection. They are overproduction, heritable variation, survival of the fittest, and adaptation. The first principle is overproduction. Malthus's work had convinced Darwin that if all populations have the potential to produce more offspring than can survive, members of the population will compete for the limited resources in their environment. Darwin described this competition as the struggle for existence. But which individuals would succeed in surviving and reproducing, and which ones would die? So here's a visual of the principle of overproduction. We have 16 butterflies, but we know that not all of them will be able to survive and therefore reproduce because maybe they're going to lack food or lack proper habitat or lack an appropriate mate. So not all of these 16 butterflies will survive. The next principle is that of heritable variation. So Darwin hypothesized that individuals in any generation will be slightly different from one another in their traits like color or size or shape. Additionally, these features are inheritable. Remember that natural selection acts only on inherited traits because those are the only characteristics that parents can pass on to their offspring. Here's a visual of the principle of heritable variation. In this group of 16 butterflies, there's a big color variation. We have light blue, a different darker blue, pink, and reddish colors. So we have quite a bit of variation in color. The third principle is that of survival of the fittest. In Darwin's hypothesis, certain types of inherited variations are better suited or better adapted to life in their environment than other individuals. For example, members of a predatory species that are faster or have longer claws or sharper teeth can catch more prey, and members of a prey species that are faster or better at camouflage could avoid being caught. These differences in adaptation would affect an individual's fitness. So fitness describes how well an organism can survive and reproduce in its environment. Individuals with inherited traits that are well suited to their environment can survive and reproduce and are said to have high fitness. Individuals with characteristics that are not well suited to their environment will either die without reproducing or leave relatively few offspring and are therefore said to have low fitness. This results in differential reproduction success, or survival of the fittest. So here's a visual of our principle of survival of the fittest. The pink butterflies have a better chance of surviving the bird's attack because they camouflage into the tree. However, the blue butterflies are kind of obvious, so they're more likely to be eaten. The pink butterflies have a higher fitness because they're able to survive, reproduce, and pass this color adaptation on to the next generation. The blue butterflies are not so lucky and will probably be eaten before they get a chance to reproduce. The last principle is adaptation. So a heritable characteristic that increases an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in its environment is called an adaptation. Adaptations can involve body parts or structures like a tiger's claw. They can also involve colors like those that make camouflage possible. Some adaptations are physiological, like the way that a plant carries out photosynthesis or the way that an animal hibernates to survive harsh winters. Many adaptations also involve behaviors, such as social behavior and the avoidance of predators. This is a good visual of natural selection for pink butterflies. The blue butterflies have been eaten, which means that pink is an adaptation since it helps a butterfly's ability to survive and reproduce in its current environment. However, when we look at living things, very often a trait is controlled by more than one gene. This makes the effects of natural selection more complex. Traits that are controlled by more than one gene often display a range of phenotypes that will actually form a bell curve. The fitness of individuals may vary from one end of the curve to the other, and natural selection can act in one of three ways. We can have directional selection, stabilizing selection, or disruptive selection. So directional selection is when individuals at one end of the curve have higher fitness than individuals elsewhere in the curve. The range of phenotypes shifts because individuals with adaptations that result in higher fitness experience higher reproductive success. So let's think back to Darwin's observations of the finches on the Galapagos Islands. Birds with big, thick beaks can feed more easily on large, hard, thick-shelled seeds than birds with smaller beaks. When the supply of small and medium-sized seeds runs low, only larger seeds would be left. Under these conditions, big-beaked birds can feed more easily than the smaller beaked birds. The big-beaked adaptation produces higher fitness and greater reproductive success. Over time, the average beak size of this population will increase, so that we'll shift our curve from that dotted line, which is the original population, to the solid line, which is the population after selection. Another example of this is how long tails on lizards look like a snake and therefore scares predators. The longer the tail, the more it looks like a snake, and therefore the less likely the lizard will be eaten. So over time, tail length would increase. The next type of selection is stabilizing selection. And this is if individuals near the center of the curve have higher fitness than individuals at either end. The center of the curve remains at its current position, but the curve overall becomes more narrow. So let's go back to our finches. Suppose that on some islands, supplies of both big and small seeds varied between wet and dry season, but sizes of available seeds stayed fairly constant. Individuals with either very large or very small beaks might be outcompeted by birds that can eat both kinds of seeds. So over time, a greater proportion of the population would have beak size in between the two extremes, and they would get medium-sized beaks. Another example of this would be that short tails mess up a cat's balance, but long tails drag on the ground and get caught up in things. So individuals with medium-sized tails are the happy medium, and those are the cats that will survive, so will have a greater fitness. So over time, our population would evolve to have medium-sized tails. Our last type of selection is disruptive selection, and this is when phenotypes at both the upper and lower ends of the curve have higher fitness than individuals near the middle. So disruptive selection lowers the fitness of intermediate phenotypes. If the pressure of natural selection is strong and lasts long enough, the single curve can actually split into two distinct curves where two distinct phenotypes are created, and this would actually increase the diversity within the species as a whole. So suppose a bird population lived in an area where medium-sized seeds became less common than large and small seeds. Birds with unusually small or unusually large beaks would both have higher fitness. As shown in this graph, the population might split into two groups, one with smaller beaks and one with larger beaks. Another example of this would be that short tails will help keep predators from catching you if you're on the ground and you're one of these little hamsters. But long tails are really good for balance in the trees, like one of these little squirrels. But medium tails really don't help. So over time, you're going to see an evolution where we'll see more short tails and more long tails, but fewer medium tails. So once you've written your notes, please complete the practice scenarios on pages 9 and 10 of your packet. You will read the scenarios, then you're going to determine whether you're dealing with directional, stabilizing, or disruptive selection, and then you're going to draw the appropriate graph. Good luck!